أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and thank you for coming along this evening, especially in exam term. Many people are revising, many people are in the thick of exams, coursework deadlines. But this is no ordinary speaker. Our guest today is very hotly anticipated, I must tell you, here in Cambridge. We're delighted, thrilled and honoured to have Paul Williams of the famous Blogging Theology YouTube account. Paul, you are most welcome.
Alhamdulillah, thank you very much indeed.
I enjoyed saying that because you usually say that to your guests. So. Just to give an outline of the event, we're going to talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll have a break to pray Asr, and then we'll come back for a general audience Q&A. Now, those who are on the Islamic Society group chat, there is a form that you can submit your questions on, but we will also be taking in-person questions by raising your hand, and I'd actually encourage that because it's a bit nicer. Just to also inform you, this event is being recorded. Now, Paul really needs no intro, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Paul is well known because of his YouTube channel, which has been a global sensation, mashallah. Currently 235,000 followers and counting. And those are subscribers across the world. And I think it's fair to say that Blogging Theology's success is a remarkable phenomenon, because not only do you produce videos on fascinating theological, historical, social, political topics, but you also interview some of the world's leading Islamic scholars, Christian theologians, academics and thinkers on all sorts of issues. And the topics you discuss are extremely wide-ranging as well, and often complex and intellectual. Some of these thinkers would otherwise never have their work exposed to such a large audience. So Blogging Theology has become a very useful and valuable force in Muslim discourse, and it also shows that there is an appetite for this kind of content. It's not that everyone doesn't just want to see sort of prank videos and food challenges on YouTube. Your work does have mass appeal. So I want to explore the Blogging Theology phenomenon, starting with a bit about you. So you grew up in Essex. Was religion a part of your childhood?
Well, thank you for that slightly hyperbolic introduction. I'm very humbled to be here with you. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. I'm aware of it. It is an honour and a distinction to be invited here, so I'm certainly unworthy of that, so thank you for those words. Another embarrassing admission, I'm an Essex boy. So I was born in Leigh-on-Sea, which is a seaside village on the south coast of Essex, into a very I was going to say boring, but very average, predictable, white middle class, nominally Christian family, where nothing much happened in the town. I quickly discovered that I was not really happy there, and I moved to London as soon as I could for the bright lights and some more interesting life. But no, I had a nominally Christian upbringing. I remember being an atheist at school because I was just in a rebellious frame of mind, I guess. But I was at school, I remember not doing very well academically in terms of my formal studies, but being passionately interested in philosophy privately. And that didn't have any connection with what I was studying. So I started reading Plato, his dialogues, when I was about 15, and that's never stopped. And people often say to me, Paul, what are the tips about how do you read books? How do you motivate yourself? And I said, I have absolutely no idea. For me, eating, breathing, reading, it's all the same thing. It's part of the expression of one's life. It's just part of who I am. So I don't actually have any advice. I don't know what to say other than enjoy it. I left Southend, the larger borough area, pretty quickly when I was about 17, 18 actually.
So what were your views on religion growing up, if you were nominally Christian but actually atheist, reading a lot of philosophy? What did you think of the whole thing?
I went through a Marxist phase. I remember being passionately interested in Marxism. I guess it's pretty cliche, I know, but it taught me a bit about history and again philosophy. So I discovered Hegel inevitably, and and some contemporary Marxist writers, particularly the English Marxist historian E.P. Thompson, who I still have an enormous amount of respect for. But religion didn't play any part of it at all. But I remember when I moved to London, and I went to an all-night party in South London, and cycling back one Sunday morning to North London, seeing a rather beautiful, what I would now call a sort of classically designed Anglican church in Islington, and just being struck by this building on a Sunday morning, aesthetically, and decided to go in because the door was open, not for any religious purpose, and having an encounter with some presence, which is impossible to put into words, like these kinds of experiences often are. But it was a powerful experience, an external presence or power, a little bit overpowering, of love. That's how I felt it. And it was unexpected and unwelcome, because I didn't go there for anything weird like that. So I felt I had to leave pretty quickly, otherwise I would probably break down. It was quite emotional. So what was that about? So that because of that experience, I decided to go back the following week for a repeat encounter, and of course nothing happened. But that was a pivotal moment of my spiritual journey. I thought, wow, maybe that was a spiritual experience. So because of my nominal Christian background, that meant, well, maybe I should look into Christianity, of course, knowing precisely nothing about Islam, of course. And so I got a copy of the Bible and started to read it, and that began a journey which led in about a year and a half later, to becoming an evangelical Christian, of all things, in my local Baptist church in London. And why that church? Because I found in that particular fellowship, in that particular church, a great sense of love, lovingness, of fellowship, a great sense of sincere caring and compassion that was shown. But it was also incorporated a lot of beliefs about the deity of Jesus and the inerrancy of Scripture and the atonement and the Trinity and so on, which went with it, and I kind of bought the whole thing.
So at this time, were you reading a lot about theology?
Not initially. I was still passionately interested in philosophy, but I began to be interested in theology. That became the next thing, because in reading the Bible has a lot of theology in it. So I turned to biblical scholars and theologians for sort of intellectual meat to come to terms with what was going on here. So that was the beginning of my interest in theology, I think, Christian theology.
Well, that's interesting. And what did you think, if anything, about Islam at the time?
I thought nothing whatsoever about it. I think my initial spiritual interest was Christianity, and I was particularly interested in Eastern mysticism because it was simply there for me to look at. But Islam wasn't on my radar at all, actually. I don't know why. Maybe because of my background. It's simply, if the question why Islam would have been, well, why not Zoroastrianism, or why not Shintoism, or why not Sikhism? It would have been that kind of question rather than. So that came later.
And how did that come?
Oh, right. Well, well, fast forwarding a rather uninteresting story by a number of years. I started to read the Bible and encountered quite innocently various perplexing questions and issues which rocked my faith, and I turned to scholars' books for answers, and oftentimes it made the situation worse. There were verses in the Bible that appeared to question the divinity of Christ, where Jesus states that he's not God or not divine, and they're there. I mean, they're real verses. And that was, of course, problematic. So off I go to biblical scholars for help. I need to find that, the verses really do say that, and it's not the devil trying to twist my mind to get me to disbelieve. And so that wasn't very helpful, and I discovered even more problems because scholars obviously had been doing their stuff, and there were issues I hadn't known about, and so it kind of got worse, actually. I ended up being quite kind of split in my mentality between continuing to formally believe and practice as a believing Christian on the one hand, but on the other hand, pursuing a line of study and thought which was systematically questioning some fundamental aspects of my faith. Right. And I didn't know how to escape that. It was just a twin track, and it was causing a lot of psychological tension. It was actually quite unpleasant and very private, because I tried to share one of these one or two of these issues at the church, but they were dismissed as non-issues. Yeah, they were simply.
Was this the same evangelical church?
Yeah. They were not equipped to deal with these questions. And looking back now, I understand why, because they were, bless them, they were fundamentalist Christians, and by definition they didn't deal with critical questions well, that they would deflect them. I didn't understand that at that time, at least not in the sense I do now. But at the same time also, after several years, I was becoming increasingly Islamophobic. And this is because where I live in London, in Maida Vale, which is quite a nice part of Westminster, and by the Edgware Road, I mean, and a lot of Arabs lived and live in that area, and they were coming up further and further up the Edgware Road towards my area, and I thought they were Muslims, but of course most are, but a lot weren't. A lot of these are Lebanese, for example, who were Christians. Well, I didn't know that. I just assumed they were all Muslims. Being completely ignorant. So in my own mind, privately, I was becoming, as a fundamentalist Christian, I saw what I perceived to be the encroaching presence of Islam ever more so into my area, in inverted commas. This is how I perceived it.
Do you think media coverage played a role at this time?
That's a question. I think my Christian context was the predominant factor,
right,
actually.
Okay.
Because yes, I think that basically Islam was demonized in that context. So I would say the Christian theological context was much more relevant.
Right.
I mean, I've never been an avid reader of the Daily Mail or anything like that, so I wasn't likely to get, or Sky News or Fox or something, but it was more from that context. I didn't kind of manifest my Islamophobia in any way that I recall. I mean, I didn't go out and do terrible things. It was just in my head. But it did begin to alarm me. I mean, I began to alarm myself by the amount of fear and worry. And I wondered how I should deal with this. And I remember, expressing this to some of my fellow Christian friends at the church, my fear of Islam, and how this was affecting Christian Britain. And I decided, not 100% sure why, but I think maybe curiosity, to go to my local mosque and actually talk to Muslims and find out if Islam really was this threat to Britain, to the West, if it really was it a terrorist religion now, because 9/11 had happened. And so I was vaguely aware of that context. So I literally walked in the door of my local mosque, which is Regent's Park Mosque, which is one of the big mosques, main mosques in Britain. Even. It's interesting. The trustees of that mosque are all the ambassadors from the Muslim nations. So our treasurer of that mosque is actually the Saudi ambassador. So I just say that it's not likely to go bankrupt, the mosque, I think, anytime soon. But seriously, just all the ambassadors. So it's a very kind of high-profile mosque. It's a very beautiful mosque, and I have some very good friends there now, even amongst people who run it. They're very, very good people. But so I walked through the doors, I saw a bookshop on the right-hand side. Bookshop, I recognised what that is. So in I went to the bookshop, and for some reason I was immediately spotted as kind of a neophyte Englishman who, is looking out of place, really. And, the brothers, they were very, very good. They took me in hand, they bought me loads of books, and they were, and that began a dialogue, a conversation, and occasionally an argument with them about Islam. And I discovered something I didn't know anything about, which was Islam itself, real Islam, not the caricature that, I didn't really know anything about it, not the external fear, the actual reality.
So thinking about some of that early encounter with Islamic thought, I know that one thinker who you engaged with was the great scholar Guy Eaton, and you read Islam and the Destiny of Man, which you actually...
Funny you should say that.
It just so happened.
It just so happened by coincidence. I have my my copy. Yes, this is the first book on Islam I ever bought. Which is, yes, it's still got rid of the original. I bought many copies since Kimmel gave them away, but this is my original. I read this. I got it in Waterstones in Piccadilly in London. Just looking on the bookshelf, wanted a book on Islam, so this looked promising. I read that as a Christian, and I remember having, at the end of the reading of it, my heart was Muslim, although my head was still Christian. I was still intellectually committed to Christianity, but there had been a deep, profound change within at a deeper level than my intellectual level.
Could you say a bit about Guy Eaton, who he was?
Yeah, I once, as an economist scholar, I once spoke to Abdul Hakim Murad about Guy Eaton. Tim Winter, of course, needs no introduction here, in all places, because he was a Cambridge University academic. And I called him a scholar, Guy Eaton. He said, a scholar? And I don't think he was a scholar in the sense that we would understand that now, but he was an incredible human being. He was a diplomat, he was a writer, he wrote some extraordinary books, he was a full-time consultant at Regent's Park Mosque, actually, for some years. What Guy Eaton called him the grandfather of British Islam. I don't know what that means, but it sounds very grand, and I don't have a problem with that. But he writes like an angel. I've never come across, well, there are a few other writers that I've come across who write so beautifully, and I wanted to just read something of him. But I do recommend his work, this is not the only book of his, to anyone who is not a Muslim who wants to know more about Islam. Particularly, it's not very PC to say that if you come from a kind of educated background, then because his language is quite elevated, so it requires a certain level of tuning into it. But a lot of English or Westerners, Americans and others, have encountered Islam and become Muslim through reading this book, actually. And many Muslims appreciate it as well.
Would you do us the honour?
Oh, yes. Okay, well, the pleasure of reading. I just wanted to share with you a passage almost at random, just to give you a flavour of his eloquence and what I found all those years ago so impressive about him. It taught me, this book showed me, it disclosed to me that, I know it sounds very naive now, but there was another religious tradition that had a profound spiritual dimension to it that at least equaled that of Christianity. Because in Christianity I knew about St. John of the Cross and the author of the Cloud of Unknowing, I knew about St. Thomas à Kempis, I knew about St. Augustine, his Confessions, and so on and so on. These are great spiritual writers. But I had no idea that there was another religious tradition that had at least, I say at least, because there is even more so, I think, in Islam, in terms of great spiritual works. And Guy Eaton was a beginning into that, a conduit into that reality. And that really was the question that I had in mind for me, that if God had spoken so clearly and beautifully through Islam, what does that say to me? But anyway, there's a chapter here called Truth and Mercy, page 73. I'm not even going to introduce it, it's fairly self-evident what he's talking about, I think. Every man and woman is inwardly a city in which there are many factions, one gaining the upper hand today, another tomorrow. The only people in whom this warfare of the factions is appeased are, on the one hand, the saints, those wholly integrated beings who have brought all such contrary forces under the control of the highest principle, and on the other, those who have surrendered entirely to the most powerful and brutal faction in their makeup, and so enjoy an illusion of peace worse than any warfare. Between these two extremes lies a battlefield. The fact that there are many people who live quiet lives of routine, neither looking to the right nor to the left, nor upwards towards the heavens, nor downwards into the abyss, is misleading. For there are forces lurking within everyone, which may remain dormant so long as no great prize is within reach, or so long as no great danger threatens. When a man turns to religion, these forces are awakened, whether for good or ill, and if for ill, may try to seize hold of it and use it for their own purposes. No ego is more inflated than the one which feeds upon religion and justifies its greed and its fury in religious terms. It can even happen that the inhibitions which restrain murderous impulses in those who live only for this world are released when the opportunity arises to murder in the name of God. Those who seek paradise walk a tightrope over hell. The greater the prize, the greater the risk. But light is light. By its very nature, it shows up things we might prefer to keep hidden. It reveals and exposes, as does that judgment to which we must all finally submit. The agnostic has a very curious notion of religion. He is convinced that a man who says, "I believe in God," should at once become perfect. If this does not happen, then the believer must be a fraud and a hypocrite. He thinks that adherence to religion is the end of the road, whereas it is, in fact, only the beginning of a very long and sometimes very rough road. He looks for consistency in religious people, however aware he may be of the inconsistencies in himself. The fact that we do expect consistency of others and are astonished by their lack of it is sufficient proof of our awareness that the human personality ought to be unified under one command. Perhaps the most difficult of all the requirements of religion is simplicity, for the simple man is all of one piece. He does not leave bits of himself scattered all over the landscape of his life. He is, so to speak, the same all through, whichever way you slice him. And it has been said that only the saint has a right to say, "I." The rest of us would do better to confess, "My name is Legion." This inward multiplicity, the multiplicity of the factions, is like an echo within the human personality of outward polytheism. On the one hand, many persons within a single envelope of flesh. On the other, many gods in a fragmented universe. Monotheism is not only a theology, it is also a psychology, as is the Shahada, La ilaha illallah. There you go. That's, I mean, what can I say? It speaks for itself. The book is like that from beginning to end. So, extraordinary man.
Deeply powerful words.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So you read Islam and the Destiny of Man.
Yeah.
You're studying Islam quite a lot, having conversations with Muslims about it. At what point did you decide to become Muslim, and how did that happen?
I think, apart from the Quran, the biggest extraordinary discovery for me, and it's still something I'm just marveling at, is the life of a human being called Muhammad, upon whom be peace. What an astonishing human being. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I read this Seerah of Martin Lings, which I think is the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful biographies in the English language, let alone a biography of the Prophet, upon whom be peace. And it is sorely underrated as a biography because of its subject matter, I suspect. But it is an absolute classic biography of English literature. So I read that, I'm just totally amazed on every level. Here was a man who was a father, a general, a statesman, a prophet, a spiritual leader, and so on and so on. You know, yeah, I've come across great prophets before. I've come across Moses, upon whom be peace. I've come across great spiritual teachers like Jesus, upon whom be peace. But here was a man who embodied in one person so many of these diverse attributes in one man, and I found that astonishing. And without going into obviously into the Seerah, which is not appropriate now, but his life was made a huge impact on me, and I had to ask myself the obvious question: if this man was sent by God, which obviously he was, what does that mean for me? You know, how can I possibly, if I could accept that Moses was a prophet of God and that Jesus was a prophet of God, by what right, by what criteria could I possibly doubt that Muhammad was a prophet of God, peace be upon them all? So the question, so I kind of, it was a no-brainer. Yes, he was, but I realized it wasn't an intellectual question. That answering yes, for me, was a profoundly existential question and would have implications throughout my life. And I knew that. It would involve, in a way, crossing a civilizational divide, an ethnic divide, a cultural divide. for moving from a majority to a minority in some ways, although I've never left. I'm now in both, of course, but you can never quite leave either. And so that actually held me back, actually, the sheer gravity of the existential implications of a decision to say the Shahada. So it took about a year or so of being and ahhing, oh dear, what do I do, you know, and praying about it and thinking about it, and just kind of just chilling and thinking, considering, you know, don't want to make hasty decisions. So yeah, it took a while.
And then you finally decided to take the Shahada. Did you do it at the local mosque?
Yeah, at Regent's Park Mosque. Yeah, I went through the formality. Yeah.
And how did your life change when you became a Muslim? Were there new challenges?
Yes. I mean, there's some of these challenges I don't even remember as challenges, like not drinking alcohol. I mean, I haven't drunk alcohol for so long now, and it's really weird, you know, because when Muslim, people don't realise, I mean, by people I mean British people in general, don't realise you can actually have a really good time with your mates without getting drunk. I mean, but this is a complete mystery to most people. They just don't get it. And I get it now because I live this reality all the time, but really people don't, and I didn't. It was like, got to give up wine, oh my God, you know, and this is a real sacrifice. You know? But this was a long time ago, and I really can't remember why it was such a fuss. But anyway, so these are the kinds of things that seem like challenges, but actually turn out to be blessings, really. I think giving up pork was more difficult, because I liked bacon butties, whatever the word is, you know. But again, one does it because what one is told to. You know, it's a question of submission, of course, which is what being a Muslim is. One submits to God. You know, but I took comfort from the fact that Jesus was a Torah observant Jew, so the evidence tells us. So he would never have touched pork, and he goes without saying that the Torah prohibits it, and Moses didn't eat it. So, you know, if we're to be good followers of Jesus today, we must do what he did and be like Muslims, actually. And Christians now, unfortunately, don't follow Jesus anymore. They think they do, but they don't, because if they did, they would do as he did. And the only people I know who do as he did are Muslims. I mean, okay, there are one or two Christians who might, but like Catholics in general don't, Anglicans in general don't, Methodists in general don't, Orthodox in general don't. So this is the great irony of history, that Islam is actually, Muslims are the authentic followers of Jesus, not Christians. This is an extraordinary irony of history. There we go.
And spiritually, I suppose it came to be, as you know, Guy Eaton wrote, that accepting Islam was just the beginning of the journey.
Yes, yes, indeed. Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, I won't go into these embarrassing things in public, but boy, did I mess up and you know, make mistakes. But I also learnt. But above all, I've been hugely blessed by Allah, actually, particularly, I mean, the subject tonight is blogging theology, but whatever success the channel has is directly and only attributed to his blessings. I'm very aware that of the huge grace that he has bestowed on the channel and its work, and that it can be taken away as well. It is very vulnerable. Not least because, you know, who knows what YouTube may do tomorrow, but, you know. So, and I'm also aware that it's now, in my own mind, perhaps we'll go into this, my understanding of the channel has changed, evolved. It's more now of a service to the Ummah as well. It's not just my hobby horse, as it was. So
on that then,
yeah.
How did blogging theology start?
Oh, in a word, COVID. COVID was the crucible. The horrible crucible of this. As it was, I mean, a lot of people found, I know a lot of people suffered, and I don't want to make light of that, but for a small minority, or not so small, I don't know, our lives changed during COVID for the better. It was a catalyst for change, strangely, unexpectedly, despite all the suffering that many people had. And so I was quite, you know, like all of us were, we were during lockdown, and although my particular job meant that I was obliged to go out and work, nevertheless, you know, I remember walking down Regent Street in London. It was like an apocalyptic scene from some Hollywood movie. Like there was no one there. Like on a Saturday afternoon, there were no human beings in central London. And I've actually got footage on my iPhone. It's quite extraordinary. So for me, I had a bit of money, and I decided to buy the latest MacBook Pro computer, which I didn't need because it was vastly overcapacitated, for my own very modest needs. But hey, I had the money, so I decided to buy the latest technology from Apple. My way of reaching out to the world during this isolating period was to make a video or two on YouTube, and I did.
So, who was your first guest?
Well, there wasn't a guest for several months. I
Right.
just blogged about stuff I found interesting. So I blogged about, I don't know, the Bible, biblical scholarship, or theology, or just what interested me. Really.
At that point, who
Yeah.
do you think your audience were then?
Oh, I was my audience. There was an audience of one. So it doesn't make much sense, does it really? But anyway, but there were a couple of people, I think, who showed a slight interest. And then after a couple of months, I thought, well, why don't I actually invite a guest on? And who can I invite on? I couldn't invite anyone, a big name, because no one had ever heard of the channel. Why would they come on? Anyway, I selected a kind of middle-ranking scholar, as I call it, the extraordinary Englishman with an extraordinary name who lives in the American South, called Sir Anthony Buzzard. Yes, you heard me right. Sir Anthony Buzzard, yes, that's his real name. And his father actually was head of naval intelligence during World War II. And I mention that because, Anthony Buzzard is a biblical scholar who lives in Georgia, Atlanta, in the States. And he's a Unitarian Christian. So he's a Christian who does not believe Jesus is God. So I kind of emailed him. So I've seen some of his videos on YouTube. I thought, he's a nice guy. Maybe he'll come on. So I emailed him or something. And totally amazingly, he said yes. And I thought, wow, this is awesome. So he came on, he was in Georgia and I was in London. And it was such fun. And he was such a good sport and a good character. And we had a great laugh. I don't mean laugh, but it was talking about the historical Jesus and New Testament texts and whatnot. And that went well. So I put that up. And then I thought, well, perhaps I can invite another scholar, and that's when I really tried my luck. So I invited Dominic Crossan, who was a seriously distinguished biblical scholar in the United States, and he said yes. And that was the beginning of what has become more recognisably blogging theology. But these guests were far and few between. Most of the stuff was my own interests, actually, rather than producing guests' content all the time.
Right, so that's how blogging theology got going.
Yeah.
As they say, the rest is history. So how do you think your vision for the channel has changed since you started?
Yeah, well, there wasn't a vision. This is the thing. There was no vision. There was no plan at all. With lockdown, new computer, let's do something with it. Let's indulge, invite a few guests from the books that I had read. Let's do my own stuff. So I produced bits and pieces of videos, which seemed to be quite popular. And I noticed after several months, I forget, maybe it's only 3 or 4 months, something very strange started to happen, and that everything I did went viral. It was like, what is going on here? And like a lot of people were signing up, and my stats went through the roof, and they just kept on rocketing month after month. And I didn't understand why, because I didn't have any plan, and I wasn't looking for. I mean, there were no clickbaits. I didn't know the audio was crap, the visual was crap. It was awful, and there was no logical reason why any of this should have been successful. I didn't know anything about anything. And I remember I had a friend of mine, a guy who appeared, he's actually an Egyptian. He'll be watching this, I'm sure, but he's it's fine, he doesn't mind, from Alexandria. He's a professor at the University of Alexandria in surgery, of all things. And he came alongside me, a very bright guy, and said, Paul, you really need to improve your audio, you really need to improve your video. And he gave me all these really technical explanations. I had no idea what he was talking about. And I said, I don't understand what you're talking about. So he went back to baby steps, and he helped me just improve, like put up the volume and tone this down and done this. And it really was excruciatingly slow progress for someone as ignorant as me. But slowly by slowly things improved. But there was no vision, there was no plan. I can't stress that enough. But I found that I started to have to think in terms of one, because a phenomena was emerging which I hadn't expected. So what do I do with this phenomenon? And that was the question. And so that was the challenge, actually. And so today, I come a long way, alhamdulillah, thanks to the blessings and grace of God. And that's not a pious phrase, I really mean that. It is only because of his, quite emotional one. Today, the channel does, okay, what's the channel today? Today, the DNA of the channel, as I understand it, is it's a bridge between the ivory tower academia, funny sitting in this institution, and what I call every man or every woman, the educated layperson, of which I see myself as a layperson. So I invite people on who I find interesting in the areas of Abrahamic faith, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and allied subjects, be it history or theology or textual studies or evolution or whatever. So it's incredibly broad in its implications. To talk about their expertise and to share their knowledge, to share their expertise, to benefit me, to benefit us all as the audience. So that's, but I try to produce my own content, because that apparently still has some traction as well. But I'm very much aware it's something, it's a service to the Ummah now, and it's no longer my plaything. It's no longer my little computer where I do my thing. It's grown out of that, and I've had to accept that responsibility, because that is what it is. I just have to be responsible.
Well, may Allah bless your efforts and accept them from you. Before we break for Asr, I'd like to turn to a bit of a more general question. The state of the Muslim community in the UK, as someone who speaks to lots of thinkers on this issue, who sort of speaks to lots of Muslims who are thinking about this sort of thing, how do you see the state of British Muslims?
Well, also, I'm not an expert. I did actually have one on, Professor Linda Woodhead. She's Professor of Sociology of Religion at King's College in London. This was several months ago, and I do recommend you see that video. She was speaking to the results of the survey, the census results rather, which came out several months ago. And she said something that was very interesting and rings true, and I've had corroborated from a number of people I've spoken to. Religion in this country in general is on the decline. We're becoming an increasingly secular society. People are not, in general, involved in formal religious adherence. Christianity is in precipitous free fall. It has been, and the trajectory is that it will continue to be so in the future. So Christianity is dying in this country, and I take no joy in that. We need a robust pushback against things. The big exception to all of this bad news, however, and you know, of course, better than I, is Islam and Muslims, and where the story is the complete opposite, according to the statistics. And I remember I went up to Birmingham a couple of months ago and spoke to Sheikh Azra there to interview him about his marvellous new book on atheism, countering atheism, forget the name of it, Islam and Atheism. And I remember speaking to some of his friends, Muslim youth, actually, who I met. And I said to them, I've heard, is it true that Muslim youth are praying, are committed, believe in the Sunnah of the Prophet, are reading the Quran? He said, yes. The Muslim youth are more committed and more praying than their fathers and mothers, and they are who are more committed than their parents, the first wave of immigrants to the UK, to England. And I said, is this true? This is in Birmingham, of course, which probably has, I think, the largest proportional percentage of Muslims in any major English city, perhaps. He said, yes, it's true across the board. And this is remarkable. And I was in Berlin recently, and I saw the same thing there during Ramadan. The mosques there are packed. And not just packed with, octogenarians, they're packed with young people, young men as well. And this is remarkable. And I have a friend of mine, Dr. Abdullah Swedi, he's an academic at University of Medina, and he wrote an article recently about the problems of Muslims in Sweden. The problems there are problems of growth, of finding mosques to pray in. There are so many committed, devout Muslims, and this is an extraordinary piece of good news. I know there's an awful lot of bad news. You all know what the bad news is. But when it comes, if I can be crude and sociological, when it comes to Islam, it's a success story in the West. Now, I know there are a lot of problems, and everyone's going to say, but what about all this? Yes, I know all that. But in terms of the committed, I find it very, there are apparently secularized liberal Muslims around, and I do believe they exist, but I don't know many of them. The average Muslims I encounter believe in the Quran and the Sunnah. They know how to navigate the pressures they get from certain ideologies, which perhaps I won't mention to get you into trouble, but they know how to resist them. They say, no, we will follow God, we will submit to God, not to the latest pressure groups. This is remarkable, and I feel very, very heartened by it. And on another note about whether or not Muslims belong in Britain at all, this is a good question that's asked, and I get this on Twitter directed at me. Say, why don't you go to live in Saudi Arabia then? All this rubbish. I want to quote a much shorter passage, you'll be easier, from this book by Abdul Hakim Murad, again, Tim Winter, of course, of this university, Travelling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe. And he addresses this very question about whether or not Muslims belong in England. And of course you can guess he might say yes, but the reasons he gives, I think, are profound. And he has a nice dig at certain other people as well. So if I may, I'll just read this. So he starts off by talking about, this is the introduction to his book, Travelling Home, which I do recommend, by the way, if you want to explore this whole question about the place and role of Muslims in Europe. And the introduction, he's talking about the universalism of Islam. It belongs everywhere. And he says, Muslims find themselves at home everywhere, for this same universalism of Islam enables a local rooting which recognizes that, quote, wheresoever you may turn, there is God's face. It's a quote from the Chronicles 3:115. Then he goes on, such is this Muslim sense of belonging that Muslim believers feel more at home in a place than any atheist could, since to lose contact with God is immediately to forfeit one's sense of connection to a place of his making. It is to feel one's roots and identity shrivel. There can be no truly English, German, or Russian atheist. Incredible statement. From this kind of Muslim perspective, Lenin was not Russian, Douglas Murray is not British, and Sam Harris is not American. They seem to wait in a forlorn foreign encampment, even when officially at home. By contrast, to become Muslim, or to arrive from an Islamically Abrahamic place, and to maintain that traditional sensibility which perceives God's signs superabundantly everywhere, is immediately to see the land with understanding, and hence to begin to grow roots and to adorn and engage the earth. Such, very roughly, is the Islamic theory of Abrahamic mobility. Unlike Israel's wanderings in exile, which await the messianic intervention which will take the people to a home greater than all homes, Muslims travel from one home to an equal other, and do not cherish a return to the mother of cities, except as visitors. They migrate Abrahamically, but every country for them is a promised land. So we belong because this is God's country and we are God's people. Atheists cut that root. They have lost connection with that fundamental reality of what it is to live in God's world. And there's a nice dig at Douglas Murray there, which if you know anything, I'm not going to go into it, if you know anything about the backstory of this, you'll know why perhaps he was mentioned by name. I'm not going to say why, because that's a story best told on another occasion. But I mean, that's just brilliant. And it really gives, it's not a political justification, it's not a cultural, it is a deeply theological and anthropological understanding of why Muslims, as Abrahamic people, belong here, but they belong everywhere, actually. In France, dare I say it, and that is a daring thing to say, apparently. In Germany, dare I say it, which is certainly daring there too, apparently. Let alone, obviously, in the obviously Muslim-majority countries in the world. So I think that kind of insight is absolutely invaluable in pushing back against that kind of, frankly, Islamophobic and atheist polemic. Why are we here? Well, we're here because we belong, and this is God's land, and we are his guests, and we are his people. We are the people of Abraham, and that's it. And if the atheists rail against that, well, sorry, but you've lost that connection. And indeed, Britain historically was a profoundly a country of faith, but it's no longer, unfortunately. And it's the Muslims that hold the banner of Tawheed, of Abrahamic monotheism, and that we can remind, if we have to, if that is our destiny, to remind and reintroduce the faith of Abraham, which is what the Quran calls it, of course. It's not a new faith. It's the old faith of Abraham, to remind the peoples of these lands what they have lost connection with, and thus to bring them home to the real home that they have lost, but Muslims can remind them of. So maybe we're here to bring healing rather than chastisement, actually. And I know Tim Winton in his book emphasizes that a lot, that we can bring news of this redemption, this healing, rather than kind of denouncing people and cutting them away, but bringing them back home. So, interesting, the title of the book, Travelling Home, Essays on Islam and Europe. So I do recommend that.
Yes, may Allah preserve our Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. One final question from me. This is a very important week for Britain as the coronation of our King Charles III. What are your thoughts on His Majesty's relationship with Islam?
That's an interesting question, and a controversial one. I mean, my most popular video was about King Charles III, as you might know, and I just made that impromptu after the death of his mother. And I was able to discover quite easily some extraordinary speeches that he had made over the years at another university, Oxford, where he had spoken. I don't know if he actually wrote the speech, but it doesn't really matter. He owned it. It was his speech. In the most eloquent and insightful ways about the place of Islam in Europe historically. This is another facet of this. He referenced Islamic Spain, of course, and the extraordinary pre-Renaissance contributions that Muslims have made in a whole range of subjects, from astronomy and mathematics and geology and medicine and so on and so on. And these discoveries, as well as preserving the legacy of the Greeks and the Romans, this was transmitted and passed on to the rest of Europe, Christian Europe, which gave birth to the Renaissance, and then ultimately to the Enlightenment. And the scientific discoveries were passed on, and in medicine I mentioned that, mathematics and so on. And he mentioned all of this. So he is a friendly face. He's a king who, inshallah, will be a friend to Muslims. However, some may say, this is the journalist way of putting it, some may say that, since he's becoming king, he's not perhaps been as vocal or explicit as what some people wanted him to have been. And I noticed in the press a day or two ago there was a call that the British people, including Muslims presumably, should make a pledge of allegiance to the king. And this is controversial and complicated because the coronation is an explicitly Christian ceremony, I understand, and he is the head of the church. And is it appropriate that Muslims should? There was one tweet that someone sent me. The only king that I have is Allah. Allah is our king, And this is true. So should Muslims be giving their allegiance to a Christian king in a Christian ceremony? I have my view. I'm not, it's not my, I'm not a scholar. You can have your view. But it is voluntary. We don't have to do it. But I would hope that he will be more proactive and more explicitly a friend of Muslims. He knows, he has an inner knowledge of it. I mean, he knew Martin Lings, apparently, the great biographer of the Prophet, and other people one could mention. So he has personal acquaintance with Muslim scholars. But how much of that he can continue to pursue and publicly manifest in his role as monarch, I don't know. I'm pessimistic, actually.
One would assume that he has to be very careful.
Yeah.
And he has to bear in mind the lesson of his late mother, the Queen, and how she sort of avoided controversy.
Yes.
It seems behind the scenes, King Charles has been in a bit of a conflict with the Church of England over what he wanted for the ceremony, and the fact that he wanted non-Christian faith leaders to sort of take part in it, and that violates canon law of the Church of England. But he has introduced an element of the coronation where he wants peers of all faiths, not just Christians, to sort of be very prominent in it. And the media, much of the media is reporting this as some sort of, tokenistic diversity, and it's because of political correctness. But of course, what most of the journalists don't understand is that King Charles actually has a very deep interest in, in traditionalism, in René Guénon in particular, the French traditionalist and convert to Islam. And so there is all that behind the scenes that many people in the country aren't aware of.
Yeah, I was impressed that Prince Charles knew about René Guénon at all. I mean, he's a pretty obscure figure unless you're interested in that kind of thing, and he's a brilliant writer, and I certainly recommend him. But the fact that he knew about him and clearly supports his traditionalism, he publicly said so, assuming this is actually the Charles speaking, and I think it is, means, wow, we've got very much a friend on the throne. But, as you say, the constitutional constraints, I suspect, will mute him. That's probably my view.
Well, thank you very much. We'll pause there and pray Asr, and inshallah we'll see you all after the break.
Inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone again. Welcome to part 2. Inshallah we now have a half an hour audience Q&A, completely open. Really excited to hear your questions, and I'm very optimistic that they're going to be good questions as well. Those of you who are ISOC members, you will have in the group chat there have been sent a form. With that form you can submit questions anonymously if you like. We will be prioritising in-person questions though, so if you raise your hand and I'll select you, and then please do try and project your voice because we have a lack of microphones apart from these two. But so without further ado, do we have our first question from the floor? Yes, brother over there.
You mentioned earlier there were a few things in the Bible which kind of raised doubts and questions. I know you mentioned the divinity of Jesus, but what were some of the other ones?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, to give you a very honest answer, there's a passage in the Gospel of Mark, the earliest Gospel to be written, chapter 13. Without going into all the issues, it appeared to me in reading that chapter, very, very simplistically and extremely briefly, the disciples of Jesus are standing in front of the Jewish temple, which stood at that time, in AD 30, should we say, remarking on this incredible building built by Herod. It was an amazing building, apparently. And Jesus makes a prediction that the temple will be destroyed and not one stone will be left standing on another stone. And then Jesus goes into the extraordinary kind of eschatological apocalyptic discourse called the Olivet Discourse by some scholars, where he speaks of the destruction of the temple, and then immediately following destruction of the temple, the word immediately is the usual word in English we find in translations, we have what is conventionally called the second coming of Jesus. So the return of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, gathering the elect from the four corners of the earth, because the earth had four corners. The point being that the end, the eschatological event, would seem to be predicted to happen within the generation of people then living. And in verse 30 it actually says, all these things, I'm giving the usual translation in Greek, all these things will take place within this generation. All these things refers to the preceding events in the chapter, Mark 13, including the second coming. Now, we live 2,000 years later. It doesn't take a genius to work out that it didn't happen. Now, this was a prima facie reading that I had of that passage, so I read off to the scholars, and I can't tell you how many commentaries that I have read on this chapter. It must be 30 to 40 volumes of different academic. I mean, whenever in a bookshop, I just grab a commentary on Mark 13 and just read what scholars are saying. And so some of them translate the words genera in Greek as race. This race will not pass away to always. But that's not accurate in the Greek. And I know a little bit of Greek, and you consult the experts. The word in Greek means generation. In other words, it's as bad as it sounds, the passage. So, why is this a problem? Well, I believed Jesus was God, and Jesus made a prediction that was false by any obvious account. Because yes, the destruction of the temple did happen AD 70. The Romans went in, they decimated it. You can read about it in Josephus's work. He actually participated in it, the great Roman Jewish historian. But the end didn't happen, and history continued year after year after year, and for 2,000 years we've still been sitting here. So how does one understand this? And I think it's fair to say the consensus of critical scholars, I'm not talking about fundamentalist Christians in American Bible seminaries, I'm talking about critical scholars, the kind of people who would teach you at Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard or Yale, the kind of people that I even interview and I've spoken to about this. The consensus is, it does say that. It's a problem. And this is an issue that has dominated New Testament studies. It's called eschatology. For 150 years, the works of Albert Schweitzer, and without going into the list of luminaries, this is a big subject in New Testament. If you study that, you'll know this. How do we deal with this problem? The imminent expectation of the end that didn't happen. And it's not just in Mark 13, it's in Paul's writings, Paul's authentic writings, not the forgeries. We see it in 1 Thessalonians. So how do we deal with this? Now, as a Muslim, of course, I believe that Jesus didn't make a mistake. The whole issue of the relationship between the Quran and the Bible, and the Injil, what is the Injil, what are the Gospels, this is a whole different subject. Fascinating, and it's preoccupied me for a long time, and we're not going to go there, because it's, unless you want me to, but I don't see the 4 canonical Christian Gospels as the Injil given to Jesus, because they were by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, actually, they weren't by them, they were anonymous, but that's another subject. So there isn't really, the fact that the Christian Gospels may say something that was incorrect or attribute to Jesus sayings that were false, like in the 4th Gospel, John, is not news to a Muslim. The Quran alludes to problems with the Christian Bible anyway. But as a Christian, it was a massive problem, and it rocked my faith, because how can God make a mistake? And it was always, there have been some quite elaborate attempts, like Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, the former Bishop of Durham, who's, I forget where he's now, I think he's at Oxford actually. He goes around, he was up in St Andrews and so on. Now he's a brilliant New Testament scholar, he's very conservative, and he comes out with a theory, which I won't go into, in his work. And really, when I read his work, I wanted to believe him. I really wanted Tom Wright to give me a compelling argument. But I just didn't find it compelling. And my sense is, looking at the critical reviews of his work by other scholars, like Jimmy Dunn from Durham University, for example, that he's not won over the academic community, because he basically absolves Jesus of any issue. It wasn't a mistake. There's been a misunderstanding about eschatology. We've got it wrong. Okay, I just didn't find it persuasive. So I think the New Testament does contain some whopping mistakes, false prophecies that never happened. It also contains statements that Jesus denies he is God, which are likely to be historical for a different bunch of reasons. And all these issues are kind of ricocheting around my head. As a new Christian, this is a heavy burden. And I am free, I'm very happy now to be free of that. I can't tell you how happy I am not to be in that world anymore. There are different, Muslims have problems. There are big problems, but they're to do with politics. They're to do with the state of the ummah globally. They're to do with neo-colonialism. They're to do with, all that stuff. But it's not to do with the Aqidah. It's not to do with who Muhammad was, upon him be peace. It's not to do, I think, with the integrity of the Quran. That's, I think, established even in the West now, beyond serious dispute, I think. There was a revisionist phase in the 80s and 90s, but not anymore. So yes, there are problems if you're Christians or Muslim, yeah, but the Muslim set of issues that we encounter are quite different, and they usually revolve around the political problems that we face, rather than right in the heartlands of our texts themselves, I don't see that as being a problem now. I don't know if that helps.
Could I just ask a follow-up?
Please.
So what about that made you doubt the divinity of Christ as opposed to just the inerrancy of Scripture, or of Christian Scripture?
What made me doubt the inerrancy of Christ?
Or what about those kind of doubts that you had over the or the authenticity of what had been in the texts made you doubt the divinity of Christ? As opposed to just the inerrancy of Scripture.
Yes, because the inerrancy of Scripture was a consequence of the error found in Mark 13. So, inerrancy of the threat. Inerrancy obviously means that something is without error, something is infallible. So Scripture does contain an error, and a big one. There's another text in Mark chapter 10, verse 17. A man comes to Jesus and says, "Good teacher," according to Mark, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "Why do you call me good? There is no one good but God alone." So there's an apparent denial, obviously, of Jesus' divinity there. But what's worse, and I spoke to Professor John Barton, who's an Anglican priest and Professor of Holy Scripture at Oxford University. I'm allowed to mention that place.
Outrageous.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Perhaps I should mention. Should I say the other place? It's like it's like in the House of Commons. You don't mention the House of Lords. You talk about the other place. That's how I should just say that. Because I spoke to him about this, and he's written about this in his work. But so in Mark 10, Jesus apparently denies he is good, or denies he is divine. What's interesting is the later Gospels, and this is the standard understanding amongst academics today. The later Gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, use Mark. Literally, they copy Mark, and they sometimes make alterations, sometimes they delete stuff, sometimes they just leave it as it is. But Matthew, when he copies Mark, Matthew wrote later, obviously, than Mark, changes the words of Jesus. And again, this is not my insight, something I discovered. This is called redaction criticism. It changes the words of Jesus to remove the embarrassment. And Jesus says something different. Now, in Matthew's version, a man comes to Jesus and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus in Matthew says, "Why do you call me good? There's no one good but God alone." So why does Matthew change Jesus' words in Mark? Because, according to Jimmy Dunn, for example, in his book, Making Christology, Matthew, who is writing towards the end of the first century, this is not the Apostle Matthew. None of the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses, by the way. Again, this is the standard view now of historians. Matthew is writing towards the end of the first century. In his community, they believe Jesus is divine in some sense. So they correct Mark's words to reflect that belief. So the denial of Jesus' divinity in Mark is removed, and Jesus' words changed. And when I spoke to Professor John Barton from another place on my channel about this, and you can watch it on Blogging Theology, he said this was dishonest of Matthew. Now, this is an Anglican priest saying that Matthew was dishonest to change Jesus' words found in Mark. And I've never come across a scholar publicly saying that before, actually. They'll say that they'll euphemize it, they'll find language to cover this, but you can see what they mean. But here we had John Barton saying that Matthew was being dishonest. So and this is not the only example, there are many other examples, which I won't go into, where the later gospel writers elevate Jesus' status. They enhance his Christology, they amplify who he is in the eyes of the reader. from a lower Christology, as it's called, to a higher Christology. And we reach the apotheosis of Christology in the Gospel of John, the last one to be written. And there, uniquely, Jesus walks around saying things like, I am the light of the world. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the resurrection and the light, etc., etc. These I am statements, which are, in some sense, a claim to divinity, are only found in the last Gospel written. They're not found in Matthew, they're not found in Mark, they're not found in Luke, they're not found in Q. This is a source used by Matthew and Luke in common with Mark. And they are 99, I remember reading it's a cliche now, but 99% of scholars have, in the last 150 years, concluded that the historical Jesus is to be found in the earlier Gospels, and that John represents a highly developed, interpreted tradition where beliefs about Jesus have been put on the lips of Jesus as if Jesus said them. So the author of John believed that Jesus was the light of the world. So he has Jesus say these things. Now that's very standard in scholarship. That's not kind of a marginal view. But you see what we're being here with a Jesus who has been manufactured and has been created from faith, but not from history. And this is another, discovering this as a Christian was really very challenging. And it still is. If you're a Christian studying this at Oxford or Cambridge now, or any university, you will encounter this stuff. This is absolutely mainstream stuff, and you have to deal with it. I was a student at university studying this, and I had to deal with it. And it scared me, because how do you process this? But that's a different subject. Sorry.
Thank you. So before I choose the next question, I'll just say, even if I know your name, I won't say your name, but you can introduce yourself and maybe say what you're studying. That might be nice, but you don't have to, because this is being recorded, just so you know. So next question. Yes, sister at the front.
Assalamu alaikum. Firstly, Jazakallah khair for being here. Forgive me, this is not a particularly intellectual question, and forgive me if it's sensitive. You mentioned that you came from like kind of a predominantly Christian kind of community, or like not very kind of well versed in kind of Islam, for example. I was wondering, when you reverted to Islam, what was that process like with your community or with your family or friends in making that transition? Because I can imagine it may have been quite a big kind of change.
Yes, I have two examples. My very, very close Christian friend, as a Christian, he was a head of department in RE in the London school, a very committed Christian as I was, and the moment I told him I had become a Muslim, he has never spoken to me since. He disowned me instantly, without any mercy. He just wouldn't talk. I mean, it was like, thump, that was it. And this is a guy who I was quite close to. We shared a similar concerns, interests. We're both passionate Christians. I wasn't going to say this, but I don't see why I shouldn't say this. It's no big deal. I'm adopted and by my parents in Southend, and I managed to track down my biological mother when I've not made this public before, but about 10, 15 years ago. I never met her. I knew, and I didn't know where she was or who she was, or even why I was adopted, because I knew she obviously had me, and she was married, and I thought, well, why was I given up as a baby? I thought maybe I was a particularly ugly baby. And I couldn't think why would a married couple give up a child for adoption? I now know the reason, and I don't really want to go into that reason, because that's not the point of the story. The point is, I couldn't find it, so I actually, you can do this, you can employ a kind of a detective agency, basically, and they track down relatives you can't find yourself. So he found her, and this is the funny thing, that she was a missionary in Africa, and she was in Zambia, of all places, as a Christian missionary. And I thought, I'd become a Muslim at this point. So not only had the prospect of saying hi, Mum, for the first time, but also telling my missionary mother that I was a Muslim. I thought, oh grief, this is so much incredible. So I did literally call her. I was at work, and it was another details, but I literally called her. I mean, what do you say to a woman you've never spoken to or met in your life? Hi, you're my mother. What do you say? So I literally said that. I said, hello. I understand you're my mother. She said, oh yeah, I was expecting you to call me. And I'm thinking, what do you mean? I didn't say what. I was really cool, maybe she's mad or something. She's not. She wasn't. She's now passed away. Bless her. She had a neurolog. Anyway, but she said she wasn't surprised at all that she was expecting me. I thought, weird, but anyway, she did. But the reason that whole story is, okay, my mother was a Christian missionary. So how did she take it? And it turned out actually she was a teacher who lived in Somerset, and she was teaching the Alpha course to a group of Christian adults who had HIV and AIDS, who were actually basically quarantined in Zambia in a compound by the authorities. At that time, that's how they reacted. And so she was there kind of sharing. The Alpha course was like a Christian evangelist course. So anyway, so not only did I introduce myself to her as her son, I didn't say I was a Muslim at first, but I did. And very surprisingly, because she was an evangelical missionary, by definition, because she was a missionary on teaching the Alpha courses, evangelical, she accepted it. And I don't know, maybe deep down she wasn't happy, but she never bashed an eyelid. She was affirming and carried on being a mother for the brief time I had her before she passed away. So I'm trying to say that was a positive experience. Despite every possible reason for it not to be positive, it was, alhamdulillah. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Question from the brother over there.
Sorry, my name's Farhan.
Salam.
So this question is kind of like a bit probing, but it's more to like understand sort of the Christian mindset when it comes to like Muslim Christian polemics. But you said that during like a year you were like umming and ahhing. I was wondering, when you first learned about Islam, was the divinity of, well, I guess lack of divinity of Isa alayhi salam it was his like lack of divinity and his status like a push or a pull during that year, and like kind of tied with that, was there some sort of like emotional sort of, because I know in Christianity it's not just the factual statement that Jesus is God, it's more like you build up like a personal relationship with, like, I guess the conception of Jesus that you have in your head. So like, was there some sort of like loss that you experienced when you became Muslim? Like you kind of lost that sort of
I don't remember actually. I think what I discovered in Islam was an estimation or a status given to Jesus which was precisely correct. So the Jews have historically rejected Jesus, obviously. Not the first Christians were Jews, but I mean in the last 2,000 years they rejected him. They don't accept him as the Messiah. Christians have worshipped him as God, but Muslims get him just right. So yes, he was human, yes he was the Messiah, yes he was a prophet, yes he was born of the Virgin Mary, but he wasn't God. And so that I saw their convergence, a very happy convergence between what historians were saying. So a common question might be for historians, did Jesus himself think he was God? So it doesn't matter what we believe. Did he think he was God in some sense, or divine in some sense? And the view is no, basically he didn't. There's no evidence. The only evidence is he didn't. He was a Torah observant Jew. You don't think that people are gods. Yahweh is God. He's the creator of the universe. He's not a guy. God is not a man. So Islam, the Quran had exactly the correct estimation. So the Christians had gone to excess, and Jews had, by deficiency, not understood who he was. So that was quite a comforting. It would enable me just to, in a sense, accept the historical realities of who he was, but still look to him as someone who was sent by God, who had something to teach me, who was a great example, a great prophet. So I could still honour him. He was still within my universe of spiritual realities, but proportionately and correctly understood, thanks to Islam. And I found that corroborated, as I say, by historical research. So all in all, it was quite a happy outcome. But in terms of my personal loss of a relationship, I don't actually remember, it's a long time ago now, but I still had a relationship with God, but it just wasn't focused on. It's confusing if you're a Christian. Who do you pray to? Do you pray to the Father, or maybe to Jesus, or maybe you pray to the Holy Spirit, or maybe you pray to Mary? Because one of the most frequently performed prayers in the world by Christians is the Hail Mary, which is directly addressed to Mary. Hail Mary means, Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. So that's 4 possibilities at least. It's a bit confusing after a while, but Islam, of course, there are no intermediaries at all. You go directly to God. And that's actually a belief I discovered that Jesus also shared when he reaffirmed the Shema in Mark chapter 12, which we find in Surah 112. That God is one and that we pray to him directly. And that's what Jesus taught.
Great, thank you. Next question. Yes, sister at the front.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Anna. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for today's talk. I really enjoyed listening to you. And I guess my question is a bit of a personal one, but you mentioned that when you were sort of learning more about Islam, you engaged in some discourses with, other Muslims. And that just got me wondering if you maybe had some trouble accepting some of the teachings of Islam, maybe, and if you could perhaps tell us about
Yeah, no, I did. And inevitably, I think, as a secular Western person, one inevitably has certain beliefs that one is socialized into. Without going, some of them are very controversial, without going into them. For example, the hudud punishments. What are we to do with them? Now, what we do with them. But I didn't understand really the understanding of that issue within the complexity of the Sharia, and having a correct understanding of that without going into it, because it's a huge subject. It's not really an issue for me anymore. But initially it was. How can you advocate the death penalty for X or Y? Well, it's not quite the whole story. I'm sure you know what the correct story is. So that was a learning curve. So there were issues, I guess, like that, which I just had to go through the pain of hearing about and then learning. One of the big challenges I had was, who are the reliable people I can turn to? I don't mean so much my friends, but in terms of scholars. Who's going to teach me normative Islam rather than some marginal sectarian interpretation, which I shouldn't get misled by. No, who are the good guys? And I now know, I think, who they are, and some of them teach at this university, mentioning no names, hint hint. And that's a relief, because I can now listen to people who are experts, and so I just don't now sit here and have problems. I can turn to them and on WhatsApp or whatever and say, what is this about? How do we understand this? But my experience of particularly Muslim youth, as I mentioned earlier, is incredibly encouraging. People are holding on to the deen, even when it's a red hot coal. And there's a hadith that speaks directly to this. We're in that now. The coal is burning, and we're told to hold on to that. Because it's the truth, and it's pleasing to God, and inshallah all will be well. So it's tough.
Well, that's me cancelled now. We have
my
time.
channel cancelled as well.
Well, knowing some of the content on your channel, I think it won't be this video to do it.
Thanks. How do you mean?
But we've got time, so I'm quite sorry that we didn't have more time for the Q&A. We have a question from a brother at the back in the maroon. Yep.
Alaikum assalam. So I can see you. My name is Imad, and I'm doing a PhD in theology. In religious studies.
Lucky man.
My question is, a lot of your videos look at questions around politics, Islam and politics, like Imam Tom, he did an extensive 3 or 4 part series on the Impossible State, or I don't know how to pronounce his name, Owamir.
Andrew Chowdhury. Over there. I was getting something from over here.
Islam and politics.
I was talking about that earlier on with someone else, which is why I misspoke there. But yeah, Overmere. Yeah, I know he is. Yeah.
So my question is, having spoken to many different academics on your blog or vlog, not right now, since perhaps colonial times, Muslims have no consensus with regards to questions of politics, how Muslims should govern themselves or relate to politics. And there are new and emerging thoughts, which I find on your blog really interesting. I just wanted your thoughts on that, and if you saw any future directions on questions around politics. And perhaps a related question, tenuously, is I see on your blogging Theology really positive interactions with Christian theologians and scholars. So what your thoughts were on the future of Muslim and Christian relationships, the opportunities there, and perhaps the limits as well. So 2 questions there.
So if I just restate those questions in case the camera didn't get them. So the first question was on politics. You've had a lot of speakers on your channel discussing new and emerging approaches to Muslim politics. What are your thoughts on those? Answer the first one first. Second is engagement with Christians.
And I've got 1 minute to do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I'm very envious, brother, you're doing a PhD in theology. But apart from my envy, Wael Halak is a professor at Columbia University who's written The Impossible State, a book that I've discussed with this extraordinarily brilliant young scholar, Imam Tom, as he's known from New York. Do follow him, watch him on his channel, Imam Tom, American guy. Wael Halak is actually a Palestinian Christian, believe it or not. He's not even a Muslim, but he is listed amongst one of the top 500 Muslim personalities in the world, and he's not even a Muslim, can you believe it? Sort of honorary Muslim, I suppose. I've actually got a quote by him. This is slightly off tangent, but I love this quote, and I do recycle it whenever I get the opportunity, so I'm going to inflict it on you. From Professor Wael Halak. Letters is about secularism. Okay, he's written a lot about secularism. What is it, and should we? Well, he wrote the following, and I think it's so good. Let us remember what secularism is, says Professor Wael Halak, the Christian. Secularism is not just segregating religious life into the private sphere. It is rather the determination of the state of what religion is and is not, where and how it can be exercised. In terms of political theology, secularism is the murder of God by the state. The state can delimit, limit, qualify, can limit, exclude, or curtail any religious practice, and thus has the power to determine the quality and quantity of the religious sphere as it sees fit. He's very good in dissecting the dynamics of secularism and what the realities of secularism, rather than the way it presents itself and justifies itself. For example, in France, laïcité, it has a certain rationale. Oh, it's just fair play for, but the reality is different. And Wael Halak demythologizes the liberal discourse on secularism powerfully, which is why I like him a lot. Islam, as you know, is a deen. I mean, the word religion is not a good translation of that. What does it mean? I don't know of an appropriate word to translate this Arabic word deen, but whatever it means, it does include politics. So it's not like a privatized Protestant faith where we just pray to Jesus in our private, it is life itself, everything, including religion, including the state and politics. One of the and feel free to shoot me down on this, and it's just my opinion, I'm not a scholar, I'm just a layman with a YouTube channel, so feel free to ignore me. But what I think I've discovered, as a fairly ignorant layman, is that the normative Sunni tradition, the normative Sunni position is that Muslims should have a single ruler, an imam, call him an imam, call him a caliph, call him what you want, doesn't really matter. He comes by lots of names, but we should be united behind a caliph, an imam, a ruler. And obviously he should rule by Islam. That we should not be cut up into a vast number of statelets or nation states, that we should be unified as an ummah. That's my understanding of what normative Islam says. By everyone, be it Al-Ghazali, be it Ibn Taymiyyah, you name it, they all seem, even the Shias, everyone says it. I think anyone doesn't say it. And we're not there. We are in a world where we are disunited and split up into nation states, and you know better than I what's really going on. So in terms of politics, and again, I'm very happy to be corrected by people of knowledge, which many of you I'm sure are, that is my understanding of where ideally we should be moving towards a unified Muslim world where people's rights are respected, which is pluralist, where Christians have their rights, where Jews have their rights and others have their rights, but we have a ruler who will be a shield against the egregious attacks on us, whether it be from certain lobbies I mentioned 5 minutes ago, or other forces that seek to secularize or destroy Islam, which are very powerfully operating, obviously, in the world today. So the good news, as far as I understand it, as an ignorant layman, is that there are hadith that speak powerfully to this, that one day, God willing, it will come about again. God will give us an Islamic world again, where we will not be divided and vulnerable to attack, cultural, political, even military attack from powers that seek to invade our countries all the time. He will give this to us, and inshallah it will happen soon. Whether or not I'll live to see it, I don't know. It doesn't really have to do with me really, but I'd love to see it. But so it's only been very political, but I was asked a political question, and that, so Umatics, Overmere, yes. So Overmere is a very interesting chap. I had breakfast with him a couple of weeks ago, actually, when he was visiting Cambridge, in London. He visited, we met. This Umatics is this concept, really exciting. I do really encourage people to look at this very kind of refined and creative intellectual movement that is beginning to come about, discussing politics in Islam. In terms of rulership, not in a fanatical sense, not in an extremist sense, but in a very respectable, considered, nuanced way, just trying to grapple with these issues about the Ummah and the rulership of the Ummah. And I really commend what he is doing. He's an outstanding scholar, and he's bringing on board lots of other scholars with him in this project to talk about discourse, political discourse and Islam. And it's sorely needed, and I'm very happy that he's doing this, and inshallah he'll be successful.
Well, I think we better leave it there.
Yeah.
Before we all get reported to Prevent.
Exactly.
No, I'm joking. The Q&A could have gone on all night, really, I think. Paul, we really have to thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
It's an absolute honour.
The honour was all mine.
I'm sure I can tell from everyone's faces that everyone's really loved it. So let's all give Paul a massive round of applause. I should say we're very grateful to Newnham College for allowing this event to be hosted here, and I would also really like to thank the Shura in charge of running ISOC and the organisers of the event, including our President Saqif and our Vice President Umar, and a special thanks really goes to the events subcommittee and to the events officers Yusuf and Iman, without whom this couldn't have happened today. So thank you all, Jazakallah khair, for coming. Thank you very much, Paul, Jazakallah, and Assalamu alaikum.